22. The Unmasking. Intro. 22. The Unmasking is an autobiographical project in which I have created 22 self-portraits that represent different ideas that have become important in shaping my identity. The self-portraits are worked in pairs, whether as a diptych or as a single composition including the two figures. Each pair of portraits belongs to a chapter, and there is a title for each chapter and for each portrait, instead of a title for each painting. In face of the challenges of language barriers and difficulty to socialize, art has become a tool to tell my story and express my feelings of isolation. The purpose of this project was to explore who I am as a person and as an artist, serving as a catharsis for my first 22 years of life. For the title of the project, I use the concept of unmasking as a metaphor for revealing truths about myself and my social environment. The recent global health events we were exposed to made me aware of the fragility of life. Social distancing and wearing masks made me question my own tendencies to distance myself from others and hide my true self. I'm now ready to show the world who I really am. The holy hairs and the hairy holes. This piece signals the beginning, the first thing the viewer would notice when entering the space, as a way of questioning what is art and what is beautiful. To me, hair has always been an important physical component of the person I am at a given moment. Hair can show time, change, growth. I wanted to display my hair to let the viewer know I had left a part of me in the project, both metaphorically and literally. I show the falling hairs I picked and cleaned from the drain after showering, apart from the hair I braided and cut myself, both placed in circular frames that represent cycles. Putting this in an exhibition context makes us question the meaning we give to things and the intention and effort we put onto something others may consider waste. The holy hairs and the hairy holes shows the different presentations and interpretations we can give to the same materials, showing the subjectivity of art. This piece allows me to demonstrate awareness of conceptual art and other contemporary themes before telling my story in a traditional art medium. I could have come to be a completely different person upon being given a name that wasn't mine. Chapter 1. Birth and Purpose. Hermoso al nacer, a su imagen y semejanza. This painting is about the religion imposed on me and the name assigned to me at birth. What came before I had any autonomy, but still had great importance in shaping who I would come to be. The first element that appears in the painting is an apple, as a symbol of creation, but also sin. The books, together with the apple, make reference to an academic context, which is the space where I developed a great part of this project. The two books reject the idea of the absolute truth and invite the viewer to question their own beliefs. The meaning of my name, Kevin, is derived from handsome and birth. Hence, I titled my first portrait Hermoso al nacer, which translates to beautiful at birth. When creating this piece, I reflected on how the name that was given to me defines who I am. My middle name is Pedro, and this name I share with my father and my paternal grandfather. It means rock or stone, and it is referenced in the stone column. In this way, this painting becomes a generational homage and tribute to my immediate ancestors. In a double self-portrait, I take the role of the Father and the Son, with a wing that represents the spirit of the Trinity. I become my protector and my protege, taking myself into my own arms and taking charge of my life. I painted myself as Jesus, to the image and likeness of the Creator, which gives the title to the second portrait, A su imagen y semejanza. This image of the Creator references my career as an artist. This alludes to how religion demands we follow a path to aspire to be like Jesus, the perfect being. Despite this, we are told we are born sinners. We are inculcated a purpose that is not achievable, leaving us with a feeling of guilt and insufficiency. For the baby portrait, I painted myself with the likeness I had when I was baptized, because it was this ritual that initiated me into Catholicism with the name Kevin. Beautiful at Birth, as a portrait title, emphasizes on the importance I give to my image, as if it were a prophecy that justifies using my own image as a model. Upon an evident contrast between my first and middle name, I always felt like they didn't go together. In a synthesis of my identity conflict, I decided to combine them. To develop my compositions, I make use of photo references. Most of these are photos of me taken by myself, with some exceptions. I looked at Renaissance religious paintings of the Madonna and Child and the enthroned Christ to establish the format and arrangement. I opted for a vertical symmetrical composition. For this painting, I started sketching from pictures of when I was a baby and when I had long hair. I attempted to block in the drawing with paint on the canvas. The faces for the portraits weren't much of a problem, since I could use the photos as a reference. However, the draping clothes, body proportions, and overall composition looked wrong, so I decided to take a step back. I took photos with my blanket to have a reference for the body and used different photos to put the composition together digitally. After this, working with a grid, I laid out the acrylic underpainting and started to establish some darker tones. Building up with thin layers of oil paint, the image started to come to life. Embraced by my family. Following the painting of me embracing myself, I show myself being embraced by my family, to acknowledge everything they have done for me since the beginning. The paintings are placed into album protective sheets to reference the same photo albums I took these images from. I wish I could tell my younger self, you have permission to be happy. Don't wait on external validation to begin doing what you're passionate about. Chapter 2. Childhood and Character. Estoy chiquito. After creating a piece inspired by traditional art, I pay homage to toys and video games, and the fictional characters from TV and movies that inspired me to create in the first place. I became interested in creating my own characters and narratives, and with time, this enjoyment for drawing characters evolved into an interest in portraiture. In Estoy chiquito, I recall my childhood by painting myself as a toy, like the ones I would play with growing up. It has always been interesting to me how, when we are younger, we are able to project ourselves and play to become whatever we want, only limited by our imagination. Estoy chiquito means I'm small in Spanish. Toy also refers to toy doll, making the title of the portrait a play with words. The concept of toys as complex characters is borrowed from an animated movie I would watch in my childhood, with the characters included in the painting having similar features that pay homage to the characters from the film. This painting shares some formal and content elements with the first one. For example, the use of green and brown for a great part of the setting, the figures that appear seated, and the angel ornament adds a religious context. The mirrors appear as a symbol of reflection and self-perception. In one of the mirrors appears a TV with the intro of a show I watched growing up that dealt with contemporary issues with a religious undertone. This painting is important in the project because it questions what a portrait is and what it can be. I've always been a quiet boy with loud dreams. Chapter 2. Childhood and Character. Careful what you wish for. For this portrait, I chose to turn myself into a video game character. I decided to make this painting inspired by my favorite video game as a child, that played with the concept of entering a new world through a painting, which is metaphorically what I try to do as a painter. This is the first time the main character of the painting appears alone and moving. The title, Careful What You Wish For, that appears on the sign, alludes to the desire to grow and become independent, and all the implications that come with that. The concept of paintings within a painting allude to the different layers of meaning to unpack in each of the pieces. One of the paintings shows the surface of the sea, while the other shows the depths of it. The setting, as with the previous painting, is an interior space. To reference that I spent most of my childhood indoors at home. The checkered floor that appears in the painting also appears in the reference video game, and it reminds me of a comforter in my parents' room from years ago. This also became a reference to the game of chess, in which every move is important and will have repercussions in whatever is to come. There is a door with a lock, which the character has already passed by. The character carries a key card in the overalls pocket that would be useless to open said door. This represents understanding our limitations and choosing our own path. The 8 by the heart is there because I was born on the 8th day of the 8th month, and the 22 by the coin is for my 22 years of life. Going from Toy Chiquito to Careful What You Wish For, there is a narrative of conflict from the implications of growing up and becoming more autonomous. Along the way in life, you learn it's not about being happy, but rather about being aware of your happiness. In the end, it's just about being aware. For this painting, I collected photos of toys and memorable moments from my childhood. I began by sketching what I would look like as a toy and selected a photo for reference. I did the final sketch in pencil to later color and finish it digitally. Once my portrait was finished, I moved on to work on the other toy-inspired characters. Two of these toys were inspired directly by real toys I have, while the female toy I designed myself. After a few tries, I arrived at this design. Once I had all the characters finished, I began working on the background. I placed the toys on a wood surface, like the one from a piece of furniture I used to have in my childhood room, where I lined up my toys for display. For wall color, frames, and ornaments, I use my great-grandparents' home as a reference. I associate this house with my childhood, because during this stage of my life, my family and I would move houses often, but my great-grandparents' house would stay the same. Once I had all the elements, I digitally constructed the image. Working with a grid, I transferred the drawing to the canvas, worked on a toned underpainting, and added a base of color with acrylic paint. I then did the final layers in oil. In this painting, I took some stylistic choices for varying degrees of realism, including outlines with different thicknesses and exaggerating some of the textures and materials. To design the character, I looked at old photos and made sketches in different styles. I included a hat with a fake bird that I own as part of the outfit. I also included a fish in one of the paintings that is inspired by a stuffed animal I have. Once I had the drawing of the final version of the character design, I colored and finished it digitally. For the setting, I sketched all the elements in pencil and followed the same process of making adjustments and adding the color digitally. I tried different arrangements, with the wall in the background being a different color and the character facing the opposite direction. Once I had the image set, I used a grid to transfer the drawing to the canvas, did a toned underpainting, and added a base of color in acrylic paint. Then I did the final layers in oil. The style of the painting stands out from the rest by defying the proportions expected in realism to feel more like a game.
Hi, I'm Kevin, and you're watching 22 The Unmasking.
Paper doll. Turning myself into a paper doll is a deliberate act of turning myself into a product. This digital illustration is made to be printed on paper and be functional. Paper doll is a transition between Chapter 2, which is based on play and toys, and Chapter 3, which makes emphasis on what we wear. I was never chosen. In a life filled with sacrifices and unrecognized efforts, I get to choose myself. Chapter 3, Indoctrination and Hierarchy. Irte, corruptum in educationem, don't move. This pair of portraits is the first I made. For this chapter, I was looking to explore the way in which what we wear defines us, and how a uniform can take away our individuality, turning us into just another member of a group. I was also interested in name tags, reminding us of our name, but also our title or position in a group. These tags and labels that indicate our place in the hierarchy. In these portraits, I appear with a school uniform I used as a student in Mexico and my work uniform I used for my first job in the US. I changed the logos to tell my story, creating a contradiction and a dilemma between the concepts of staying or leaving. The first is titled Irte, Corruptionem Educationem. Irte means to leave or go away in Spanish, and Corruptionem Educationem means corruption in education in Latin, and it speaks to my experience as a student in this educational institution. The second portrait title is Don't Move, referencing how I felt trapped working in that place. Both confined to the space between the borders of the canvas, one hopeful for the potential of a future of recognition through discipline, while the other seems to have lost all optimism without a chance to escape. The previous painting, Careful What You Wish For, prepares us for this chapter, which relies on the text we see in the painting to understand the full scope of the portrait's meaning. The red carpet trail also connects us with the red vest in the upcoming painting. In chapter 2, we have the contrast of the inactive seated figure and the moving character. And in chapter 3, we transition to the contradiction of going away against not moving. I made these portraits right after quitting my job, where I lasted 6 years without knowing an alternative. It was like ending a toxic relationship in which endless times I justified the lack of appreciation of my work and the injustices of those that held greater power. These paintings are in honor of those difficult choices that forged the path of my life, allowing me to grow and change through honesty and sacrifice. For one of the portraits, I took a photo in my work uniform, and for the other, I referenced old photos to put together the composition. I made sketches to scale in which I experimented different options for the background before deciding to keep it flat to keep the focus on the figures. I transferred the drawing to the canvas using a grid, worked a base layer in acrylic paint, and began adding the final layers in oil. Then I followed the same process for the second portrait. I was not convinced by the portrait in my school uniform, and I couldn't quite tell what was off. Having used different photos for reference made it even more difficult to decide which direction to go. I digitally changed some features, fixed the placement, and finished the background as best as I could. Even this improved version of the painting was not enough for me, so I decided to start over. I chose a new photo, changed the direction of the eyes, and made some adjustments to the clothing. The new photo showed a more natural expression and more interesting angle. The process went a lot smoother, having a single reference, and I learned that some extra effort in finding the right reference can save a lot of time in the long run. Once both of these portraits were finished, I was ready to continue to explore the concept of portraiture and push the boundaries of my creativity. School. Going to school in Mexico, I learned that even if I earned a grade, my teachers had the power of choosing to give me whatever grade they wanted. When I was in 7th grade and the first evaluation period for math class came, I had all the points for assignments that accounted for 80% of the grade. The other 20% was graded based on attitude and behavior. I was well behaved, did all the work in time, and participated often. I had accumulated 8 points from assignments, 2 points for behavior, and aside from that, I had an extra credit point. In total, I added 11 points out of 10, but the teacher gave me a 9, with the argument that she didn't give out 10s to anybody in the first evaluation period, so that students didn't think her class was too easy. This didn't make sense to me, and I couldn't understand how a math teacher made a calculation so arbitrary. I had a streak of always obtaining the maximum grade in the subject from years ago. This incident made me lose motivation to be academically successful. My grades meant a lot to me. In my early school years, I was always diligent in class and often participated in school activities. I had the highest grade average of my class every time and received many accolades. I had many teachers with fair judgment and great teaching abilities, but many others who got their teaching positions through connections and didn't seem to know what they were doing. There was another teacher I had in middle school who taught ethics, and when she would grade me, she would always give me 10s. Once she told me, "What else could I grade you with?" as if she was unwillingly giving me the highest grade, despite doing all the assignments as asked. When I started 9th grade, there was a change in the administration of the school. This teacher took advantage of her influences to be the one to carry out the directions of our school events. She was a tutor of the other ninth grade group, and she always gave her students the opportunity to participate in said events, while our class was mostly ignored. There is an award, which is the highest recognition given by the school, that is granted to someone graduating middle school or end of ninth grade in Mexico, based on academic performance. It was evident how this teacher used her influence and power so that one of her students that was always assigned leadership roles by her received this accolade. Academically speaking, a number of other students had a point average that was higher than hers. Mine was the best of the generation. When the award was presented, there was emphasis in that this recognition prioritized leadership before academic performance, as if trying to justify that choice. I was always willing and participating in whatever I was given the chance to, and I had the best grades of the class. I still believe perhaps I should have gotten the award if it weren't based on something so subjective that cannot be measured objectively. This experience taught me that no matter the amount of sacrifice and effort, deserving is not enough. For high school, I only attended 2 semesters in Mexico. Based on my grades and admission test scores, I should have been given priority in choosing my school shift. I wanted to attend in the morning since that's what I was used to. However, they assigned me to the evening shift. During this time, I was able to present myself from scratch, without prejudice, without being the studious one that had difficulty socializing. I encountered many friendships that made these hard times more tolerable. It was a challenge to adapt to a new school shift and deal with the negligence from administration. Occasionally, some professors I had wouldn't go to class without prior notice. Some others would arrive late without justification, as if they didn't take seriously the time and education of students. It was no secret that many teaching positions were given based on connections and influences rather than knowledge of the subject or the ability to teach. Being school the only thing I dedicated my time, attention, and effort to, I suffered from not being able to do anything to improve my conditions. This made me go through an identity crisis. For my second semester, I was one of many students that asked for a change to the morning shift, and they did give it to me for having the best grade average. I had hoped that things would be better in this shift, but everything stayed the same. One day, someone from administration came into the classroom to ask who spoke English, because there was a potential opportunity to study abroad. It was another classmate and I who raised our hands. We were asked some questions in English, and he showed interest in her. I was dismissed on the spot. This incident led me to think about how studying abroad would perhaps solve all my problems. I had already gone to school in the US in elementary, and in comparison, everything had always been better. More opportunities, resources, and appreciation of effort. I insisted to my mother that I didn't want to be in Mexico anymore, and I convinced her to let me go to the US. When I was 15, we traveled to the US during the summer to visit for 2 months. If I was able to find someone to live with, I could stay. And I did. Work. I arrived to Nebraska, United States, with my mother and my sister. When they returned to Mexico, only I remained. It was my first time apart from my family, and at 15 years old, I began to work and take care of myself. My choices had forced me to grow. I will always be thankful with my aunt and her family for letting me into their home. In exchange for periodic affordable payments, I didn't have to worry for food or a place to live. During this time, I learned to better appreciate everything my parents had done for me, because I began to not only work to sustain myself while being a full-time student, but I also was in charge of many responsibilities I would delegate in the past. My first job was in a fast food restaurant. I applied there because it was the only place that was walking distance from where I lived, and back then I didn't have a car. When I applied, I didn't know how to do anything, but I was willing to learn. Although I was hoping to work as a cashier, I was hired to start working in the kitchen. I barely knew how to cook at home and had to learn how to fully operate and clean fryers. Most of the cooks were Mexican and spoke Spanish, but they wouldn't take me seriously. I don't know if it was my age or the lack of ability when I started, but they all thought I wouldn't last long. No matter how difficult the job was for me and how disrespectful my coworkers were, I didn't have any other options. I was missing my family and I was tired of all my responsibilities, but I was more tired of my situation as a student in Mexico. I had to keep going without asking myself if I wanted to leave everything and return home. Because if I did, perhaps I would return to the situation I wanted to escape from in the first place. I began working in fryers and washing dishes. Then I worked dressing burgers and making salads, and finally learned to operate the grill. During summer vacations from school, I would go to Mexico to visit my family and take a break from work. In this period of time, I would rest and recharge to return more motivated to work and study. In the 6 years I remained at this job, I learned to do all kitchen work. Then I worked as a cashier and finally was ascended to a supervisor position. But without getting a pay raise that was proportional to the work I was expected to do and the time I had remained working for the company. When I started college, I had to get a car to be able to get to campus. Once I had a car, options opened up for me, and I could have left and looked for another job. However, I decided to stay out of gratitude because they were the first to give me an opportunity. Time after time, there were situations that showed the lack of accountability of other coworkers and the people in charge. I would speak up about it and hope that things would change, but they never did. My patience ran out, and in that moment, I decided I didn't ever want to work again with someone or for someone that doesn't show the same commitment and dedication I am willing to put into what I do. It was important for me to make this painting right after quitting my job, and to me, it was the best way to begin my journey into this project. In summer vacation of 2021, I left my job for the last time without knowing if I would come back. I didn't return. After 6 years, I had ended my journey working in that place, and despite feeling anxious for the uncertainty and change, everything worked in my favor. When I came back from Mexico, I applied to work in a few places that matched my availability as a full-time student. I had 3 job interviews in the same day. In the first 2, they assured me they would call me soon so I could start working. But in the third, they hired me on the spot, so I kept this job. I worked here as a waiter and bartender for a year. In the first month of work, I was still in vacation from school, and I worked as many hours as they would give me. I had never earned as much money as fast. The money I was making was mostly from tips, and for the first time, I felt like I was being compensated proportionally to the work I was doing. Although this job was very demanding physically and mentally, in the year I remained here, I was able to save enough money to leave for my last semester in school and focus on my thesis project. There's no point in pretending to be brave if it only gets you closer to your grave. I could tell you where I'm from, but I have yet to discover where I belong. Chapter 4: Alienation and Belonging. Mexican versus U.S. American. Growing up, I would move from the U.S. to Mexico and back. When I was starting to adapt, my parents would suddenly decide we would move out. With time, I learned to detach myself from the people around me, because after having to leave so many friendships behind, it becomes painful. The left side of the painting represents Mexico, and the right side represents the U.S. This painting expresses the identity conflict of not knowing where I belong. I included stereotypes from each country that I don't identify with, keeping a more cartoony style to emphasize that these figures represent the general concept of a trope rather than an actual person. The borders on the top and bottom are red, while the sides are green and blue respectively, to match the colors of the flags of each country. There is some symmetry to the way the characters are placed, with each character having a counterpart on the opposite side. For example, on the top left corner, I placed the Virgin of Guadalupe, since the town I'm from in Mexico is very traditional and religious. While on the top right side, I placed the Statue of Liberty, because freedom is a symbol of U.S. nationalists. I kept the emphasis on the figures rather than the land or the setting, because it is more the different culture and values I don't share that made me feel out of place. For the portrait titles, I chose Mexican versus U.S. American. Mexican with a negative contraction expresses how I didn't feel like I belonged in Mexico, but also all the things I couldn't do based on the limitations imposed by my environment. US American intends to be specific about the way we refer to people from the US, instead of the single word American. That shows entitlement and ignorance by disregarding all other nationalities from the American continent. I made myself larger, not to make me seem more important, but to make me appear separate from the rest. And the Mexico side, I appear with nice clothes, as if to contrast with the other characters around, pointing out my privilege of having more resources with my citizenship being born in the US. On the other hand, in the US side, I appear with cheaper clothes, which alludes to not having the same opportunities as other people around me for being on my own. On each side, I stand on a pedestal. On the Mexico side, I stand atop of a cactus and a bed of flowers that represent growth and nurturing. And on the US side, I stand on a brick structure covered in money that shows the importance of resources for stability. The cactus I hold in the flower pot shows a displacement from the place I grew up in. A cactus is resilient and can survive and adapt to many different environments. The piggy bank represents the accumulation of resources to eventually achieve freedom. Some aspects of my story feel more honest in English and others in Spanish. That's why I have some titles and descriptions in one language or another, rather than translating everything. Frida Kahlo makes an appearance here. She is the only other real person aside from me that appears in my main line of paintings. I consider her to be an inspiration, not because of her style, technique, or formal elements in her paintings, but rather for her content and her storytelling. I included her in this painting because she also created work about her conflicting identities and is famously known for her double self-portrait. In chapter 3, we have the question of going away or not moving, with the student in Mexico aside the employee in the US. In this chapter, we have a conflict of identities of constantly having to adapt to a new environment between the two countries. In the dry desert, a cactus retains water within to survive the displacement, to hold out apart from the ground of sprout. I say goodbye again, adios, and again, uncertain of what happens when we look away, to those who stay. Adios. How's the weather, son? I remember them in Spanish. Los recuerdo. Is it snowing? And I miss them in Spanish. Los extraño. Along with sentiments I'm unable to translate or change, I hold them tight, in my memory, to survive the displacement, to hold out against the overflowing doubt. Y los extraño. The thorns shred words from within my throat. Who am I? My tongue is tight as an exotic melody bleeds into the air that leaves me forever unfitting. This painting took the longest to complete from beginning to end, around 7 months from planning to finishing the painting. First, I made a list of all the possible character stereotypes I would include, and then I made a sketch in a simple pose for some of them, to find a consistent style and character design. For each figure, I looked up pose references and gave each of the 22 characters a dynamic pose. Once I had all the pieces, I put them together digitally and added color. After trying different arrangements and background colors, this is the design I landed on. With a grid, I transferred the drawing to later outline everything and add a base layer of color in acrylic paint. The painting remained at this stage for almost 4 months. Once I returned to it, I refined all the outlines and did the final layers in oil, first working on the skin of the characters, then on the clothing, and finally on the background and other elements. Importance of numbers. It was important for me to include numbers for each of the portrait titles. These numbers are an indicator that each portrait has a place in a sequence that adds to the holistic value of this project. The number 22 is a symbol that states that I was 22 years old for a greater part of the development of the project, and that the project concluded in the year 2022. This is why I decided there would be 22 self-portraits. The number 2 that appears in 22 twice is a representation of pairs. Some of the paintings show 2 figures, creating a tension for the way the portraits may complement or contradict one another. This painting has 4 figures that represent the 2 and 2, or the 2 plus 2 equals 4. while this other one only has one, as a symbol of identity and individuality. This piece has 22 figures, 11 on each side. All the paintings have a specific number of figures that deliberately become an indicator of the meaning. In a time in which it seems impossible to separate the artist from their art, unifying them seems to be the only alternative. Chapter 5: Dignity and Display. The Creation, the Creator. In this chapter, I reference the act of creation and the act of being created. This painting invites us to question the influence of the artist as a creator in relationship to that of the model as inspiration. When the model and the artist, the creation and the creator, are one and the same, the portrait acquires a complexity particular to itself. The portrait of the creation is a reference to the painting The Creation of Adam by Michelangelo for the pose it holds. There is also a reference to Comedian, a contemporary art piece in which Mauricio Catalan taped a banana to a wall. We have the contrast of one of the most popular Renaissance paintings against a piece of conceptual art that ridicules the art market, raising awareness of what it is we value in the subjectivity of art. The portrait of the creation stares directly at the viewer, showing him self-conscious of the fact that he is being observed, with his big toe in proximity to the creators. The creator appears immersed in the act of painting, as if the viewer wasn't there. However, the accentuated pose shows an artificiality that makes it evident that the creator is aware of his context. A bitten apple appears in the lower left corner, and it represents the creation of Adam in the context of sin. On the right corner appears a cell phone, of which the brand makes reference to the same fruit. It's a contrast between tradition and modernity, as it is a contrast between classical art and contemporary art. The format of this painting is based on other compositions I've made that show a reinterpretation of the narrative of the creation of Adam and Eve. So I not only take inspiration from known works of art, but also my own original paintings. Instead of the tree, there is an easel, from which an apple is growing. But in the easel, there is no canvas, because the canvas is the painting that we are looking at, transcending the reality of the context of the painting. There is a butterfly as a symbol of transformation next to the hand of the creation, while in the creator's side there is a caterpillar to create the connection that they both exist in relation to one another. I painted a brain and a heart that appear large and exposed, as a representation of ideas and feelings, which are very important for art and its meaning. I did this animation for my illustration class. It was my first time making an animated self-portrait, and it was intended to be promotional material for my exhibition project. I drew inspiration from Botticelli's Venus and from Michelangelo's David for the pose. I made this with the purpose of acknowledging my commitment to turn myself into a work of art. In the animation, a butterfly appears and turns into a 22 symbol. The 22 symbol is a representation of a heart too, and the concepts are reflection and symmetry. It was important for me that this illustration kept the textures that made it look like a drawing on paper, to be able to achieve the illusion of a moving drawing. For the portraits in this painting, I captured myself in the respective poses. I added the other elements digitally, and I modified the hair so that it looked more like the illustration that inspired this portrait. With the help of a grid, I transferred the drawing to the canvas and started with thin layers of oil paint. I did a base with the complementary colors of all the elements in the image to give it more depth and make the colors pop. The purple in the borders intensifies the contrast of colors and makes them stand out more. In the background, we see mainly secondary colors: green in the grass, purple in the mountains, and orange in the sky. The primary colors are used to highlight key elements, such as the blue in the paint, the red in the apple and the heart, and the yellow in the easel. The yellow background from the previous painting is continued in this one to highlight the depth of the horizon line. Upon making the decision to become my model, I became more conscious of the way I look. I wanted to look better, to be a better model. Chapter 6: Vulnerability and Vanity. On Eating, Bodying. In my process of identity exploration, I became aware of the importance of my image and my body in relationship to how I am perceived by others. With time and experience, I learned that the image I projected was, in great part, a reflection of my habits and decisions. When I had just arrived to the US, I was very skinny. Starting a new job, changing my sleeping habits, and adapting to a new diet led me to begin to gain weight. I never paid much attention to the appearance of my body. I rather focused on school and work, leaving whatever else aside. Towards the end of spring 2018, I began having serious acne problems. My face would hurt a lot, and it was painful to even open my mouth because of all the sores I had. After trying with every product and homemade remedy to treat acne I knew, I gave up. I had accepted I might remain with this issue for the rest of my days. I then began to focus on regulating my sleeping habits. I also started to drink water every day, first thing in the morning. I stopped eating many things that were tasteful once I became aware they would cause me digestive issues. I progressively changed my habits, and with a cleaner diet, my acne problems began to diminish. For a long time, the acne scars remained in my face, but I wasn't bothered, knowing things were getting better. As a side effect of my new habits, my body also began to change. I was getting leaner and started to feel more energized and motivated to work on my appearance. I became more aware of my body and my habits and decided to begin to work out at home. The difficulty and effort were rewarded with time. I began to feel better and look better. Everything in my body was functioning more organically once I started giving it what it needed. When I began losing weight, many people started to ask questions. Despite feeling better than ever before, the comments I heard made me feel insufficient. Thus, I decided to paint the uneating portrait that represents the feeling of insufficiency, being unable to reach the body standards imposed by our social environment. On the other hand, we have the bodying portrait that represents the idealized version of the body reaching its full potential. It exists as a reminder that we can always do more to improve our appearance and physical condition. My relationship with my body continues to change as I learn. These portraits show two opposite ends, interrupted by a mirror. The mirror shows the midpoint, reality. It also invites the viewer to see themselves before speaking about someone else's body. In Chapter 5, I show myself as art and as artist. Now, in Chapter 6, I show my body as my own changing project, improving and modifying my appearance to be a better model. In this chapter that shows the halfway point of the project, the apples appear again, this time echoing the shape of the figure's body. It reminds us of the concept of creation, but also introduces us to the idea of decaying, hinting at the fact that every story has an end. Mirror. In Chapter 6, that deals with themes of the body and self-image, I decided to include a mirror. The mirror is roughly the same size as the portraits next to it. It is placed in the middle of the paintings that represent the feelings of insufficiency and idealization of the body respectively. The mirror shows us our real image and becomes an invitation for the viewer to see themselves as part of the project, reflecting on their own personal narratives. There are 11 portraits as part of the project on each side of the mirror, making it an indicator of symmetry. The portraits acquire a meaning in context of their placement in the sequence, but also in relation to their counterparts indicated by the axis of the mirror. For the process of these paintings, I documented my body changing. The shift in my habits, diet, and physical activity were reflected in the changes of my body. I took many photos of my body for a long time to inform my decisions when making these paintings. I ended up deciding to use these photos, and I digitally modified them to exaggerate the contrast and make the bodies appear more unreal. I also made a deep ethereal background to highlight the figures. Once I had finished the image, I transferred it to the canvas with the help of a grid. In my last semester, as time was running out, I began planning out in detail what every day would look like once I began to understand my process and timing. Sometimes, between the crumpled papers and piles of clothes, I can't seem to find my keys or my desire to live. Chapter 7: Place and Privacy. Room. For the development of this chapter, I focused on the relationship between a person and their environment. The visible physical objects in the space reveal information about the state of mind of the subject, thus creating a complex portrait with a figure existing in relation to its surrounding space. The setting for this portrait is a windowless room in the basement. In Room appears a self-portrait in the form of a sculpture with pig features. In said sculpture, there is a tower of hats that represents the different presentations that a person can have. One of these hats is the one that appears in the Careful What You Wish For portrait, and also the fish in the painting appears here as a stuffed animal. The objects surrounding me have history and sentimental value. It was important for me to document my room, the place where I developed a great part of my creative process for this project. There is a painting palette for watercolor, some weights, clothes thrown on the floor, crumpled papers, empty water bottles, a backpack, a banana, an apple, and many other things that gave context to the narrative of my everyday life. Just like we previously saw in the last chapter, that our body changes as we change our habits, our environment does too. The photo camera mounted on the tripod is an indicator of the tools I use to document myself and my environment. Although I'm alone and in the comfort of a private place, seemingly unaware of the context, the camera points directly at me, to point out that I am posing for the camera, because I am aware that I am the model. On the right side of the figure, there are some sticky notes on the wall, with the things that are left to do. In the upper corner, there is a hanger, object that is present as a reminder. Reminder. Inspired by the clothes we hang to put away and forget about, I came up with the illustration, reminder not to hang myself, in rejection of the idea of putting myself away in a corner as time continues to pass. It embodies the guilt of not doing something meaningful with my life. Chapter 7: Place and Privacy. Studio. In the previous painting, the internal thoughts are reflected with honesty in a portrait that shows the subject and its privacy. This painting also shows my personal space. However, it is done in a context of a space open to other people. In here, there are more expectations as I am more exposed, and I feel the need to embody a version of myself that shows a good performance as an artist. To me, it was important to document my workspace in the school's art studio, because the space won't be the same before and after I interact with it. The portrait is titled Studio, and it shows me using the same gray clothes that appear on the floor in Room. The paint spots and stains on the table, on the floor, and on the wall show the history of the place. Despite being someone who tries to preserve shared spaces, I believe those elements are important factors in the narrative of trying to adapt to a place. This painting was my way of showing my craft process and the place where my ideas become works of art. There are canvases with finished paintings, others with paintings in progress, and a few more still wrapped in the package, showing insight into each of the stages of making a painting. The window has the function of letting in light, but also as a reminder of the outside world and our existence in relation to it. This is a significant contrast with Room, because of its setting in a windowless room in the basement. There is also a contrast of cool and warm colors. If Room represents the ideas and the privacy, Studio represents the physical manifestation of those ideas to be shared with the world. There is a variety of school supplies and art materials, empty water bottles, masks, and other objects that show my process and my interaction with the environment. In this shared space, I use what is available to me to make it more cozy. I use the furniture and objects to delimit and separate my space. The table creates a barrier and it's full of objects. The chair is also placed to block the way, in a certain way, acting as a door. This chapter exists in symmetry with Chapter 5, established by the axis of the mirror. Both chapters deal with art themes. While Chapter 5 has more abstract representations of concepts, Chapter 7 shows their physical counterparts, each with unique representations of the model and the artist. If I had the chance to choose what my life would look like, perhaps I'd choose exactly this. For the room painting, I was vaguely inspired by a small sculpture piece of my room I did in 2018. I took various photos of myself in bed and of my room, and did some preliminary sketches to see which way to go. I also took some close-up shots of different parts of the room in case I needed to reference them for details. After settling for this photo for the portrait, I composed it into a picture of the room I liked. Once I had finished editing the photos into cooler colors, I transferred the drawing to a canvas, again using a grid. I started with an underpainting in cool colors to establish outlines and darker tones in acrylic. Then I added some highlights in yellow. After that, I added in the color. With oil paint, I began to work on the final layers. I followed a similar process for the studio painting. I took a few photos of my studio space and tried adding in a photo of me for the portrait digitally. However, this didn't work because it looked inconsistent. I had a friend come over to the studio and I took a couple test photos. After I was convinced by the layout, I had my friend hold my recording device in position and took a few videos with a 0.5 aperture. Later, I took screenshots and edited the colors in the photo warmer. Once the image was ready again, I followed the process of drawing, underpainting in acrylic, and the final layers in oil. Being in the space I was painting became an interesting experience. I was able to look around to inform my decisions and to better understand the reference picture. The amount of detail in this painting is overwhelming, and completing it in such a small scale made it a bigger challenge. Many times, people will have opinions about you that have nothing to do with you, but everything to do with them. Chapter 8 Social and Solo. Kevin el Marraleno. In this painting, I present the idea of facing the world from an individual and social context, contemplating the expectations imposed on us, and recognizing how we submit to them. The title of the first portrait is Kevin, because that's my name. The second portrait is El Marraleno, based on a nickname I got. Marraleno comes from combining marrano, which means pig, and Magdaleno, which is a name. The expression in these portraits is cold and distant, as a defense mechanism, among knowing that not all viewers will have good intentions. The bird is in memory of the days of summer staying in Mexico, when early in the morning the bird singing would wake me up. The mouse represents the memory of the time a mouse got into the basement of my aunt's house where I lived. Sometimes I would hear it roaming around at night and it wouldn't let me sleep. The artificial colored lights intensify the contrast and make everything more dramatic. In Chapter 7, we have a private place and a shared space. Now in Chapter 8, we see the contrast of our social projection and what we really are when we are by ourselves. This chapter is symmetrical with Chapter 4, in which I explore alienation and the sense of belonging in relation to the people around me. Here it is the personal and social identities. I wanted to show the perks and disadvantages of being alone or in a social setting, being able to share but sacrificing authenticity, or being totally free of judgment but not having anybody. My nickname, El Marraleno, makes me feel like I belong, a positive reaction, contrary to what somebody else would commonly think of being compared to swine. Pigs are animals with a generally negative connotation. Hence, this portrait expresses the side we hide to the public in fear of being judged. With a comparative of two portraits that are very similar, we can see there are subtle differences in what we are and in what we project. It is knowing that external opinions about us are subject to a frame of reference that many times has nothing to do with what we are. Kevin el Marraleno. My first time using pig features in a self-portrait was when I made this sculpture. I measured my head, shoulders, and face to make a drawing to scale and have everything turn out in real size. In laminated insulating foam, I started to cut the general structure with a saw. Then I started shaving to refine the forms and did final adjustments and details with sandpaper. Then I put the pieces together and covered it in a thin layer of plaster. I sanded everything again to soften textures. I painted the sculpture with acrylic paint, put on a pair of glasses I didn't wear anymore, and an old t-shirt to make it look a bit more like me. The sculpture ended up being larger than I planned, with the added volume of the plaster. I dedicated more than 50 hours of work to this piece, and I was very proud of the outcome. Time after, I made another sculpture self-portrait, this time in human form, focused more on the likeness. I followed the same process used for the previous Marraleno sculpture. This one has a lot more texture since I didn't prioritize softening the shapes as much. With time, handling, and transportation, the pieces started to wear out. There were cracks and parts that broke off, and instead of trying to restore it with the original materials to make it go unnoticed, I decided to paint the cracks with gold paint to highlight them. Borrowing from the concept and technique of kintsugi, I was celebrating the imperfections, the change, and the deterioration. I go out to dinner and share the details of my day with an empty chair. This painting was the one that took the least amount of time to complete. I wanted to explore the concept of having two paintings in the same canvas that were separated by painted frames, but still felt related and cohesive with each other. In one day, I took the photos and edited them. In another, I made the drawings, and in the last two, I began and finished the painting. When editing the photos, I removed the facial hair, I modified the light colors, and put in the additional elements. Sometimes I feel like a mouse in the dark, afraid to come out, hesitantly waiting for the moment to emerge. If I'm alone, let it be by choice and not fear. Chapter 9. Reflect and Reveal. I once came out of the closet, but decided to go back in. Following the continuity of the previous painting, this chapter deals with the way in which we hide and protect upon the expectations imposed on us. When I was a child, I always wanted to have longer hair, but my parents never let me. Also, in school we were required to have short hair. Since then, I wanted my hair to be longer, but I was never able to grow it out until I left my parents' house and stopped cutting it. My hair grew and grew, and once it was long, it became a symbol of freedom and autonomy. People started to tell me not to cut it, but I had already fulfilled my need to have long hair. It was as if my hair had already carried out its purpose. Growing up, I was told to keep my hair short, and when I was able to grow it out and wanted to cut it, I was suggested not to. I cut my hair with my own hand as a symbolic act of changing and overcoming the past. My hair was an important part of my image and my facade, and I felt it was necessary to get rid of it to find who I really was. The title of the first portrait is I Once Came Out of the Closet, and the second one is But Decided to Go Back In. Some titles I translate from English to Spanish or vice versa, but not this one. Some things feel more honest to say in Spanish or in English, and this is one of them. I was always afraid of what my family and the people from the conservative town I am from in Mexico might think, so I have avoided saying it out loud. This painting shows the physical act of having cut my hair, but also expresses the fear of the consequences of being something other than what is considered within the norms. It was more important for me to keep the focus of this painting on revealing the pressure I felt upon the possible rejection, rather than defining what I am. The first portrait has an open, relaxed body language, while the second is closed and tense in its pose. On one side, we have the vulnerability of the truth, and on the other, the protection of concealing our true selves. In the left side, the space is open, but uncertain. In the right side, there is a closed space with a clear way out. The open threshold behind the figure reflects the anxiety of the secret being discovered, the way the truth could come from behind to reveal that which I have been trying to hide for so long. This chapter is symmetrical to chapter 3, where we deal with the question of going away or not moving. Here, in chapter 9, we encounter the dilemma of addressing my secret or pretending it isn't true. This painting explicitly acknowledges the possibility of me being something other than heteronormative, ambiguous enough that it doesn't define me, but clear enough to take away the power from fear of being different in the process of discovering who I am. Unmasking. This is another animation I did for my illustration class. In it, I show my unmasking as a literal and metaphorical act of revealing my face and showing my truth. Think of the mask not as an object, but rather as the act of submitting oneself to what we believe others expect of us. With 2 fingers in each hand, I remove the face mask. A heart appears and becomes the 22 symbol, as a signal that I am putting my heart into the project. For this chapter, I captured videos with the clothes I appear with in the painting, to later select still images from for the portraits. I removed my facial hair and added the long hair digitally on the left portrait. I also changed the colors of the clothes. I flipped the image on the left in its vertical axis so that the light would bounce on the figures from the opposite sides, keeping the symmetry. I decided to divide it right through the middle and intensify the tension. I transferred the image using a grid. I did the underpainting in purple and worked the last layers in oil starting from the background, then the portraits, and finally the clothing. I remember you now that I've learned to say I love you, regretting I didn't say it when I felt it. Sometimes it is inevitable to fall in the noble and selfish act of extolling our opponent. Chapter 10: Contradiction and Conflict. Final boss? Continue. In this chapter, I show my internal battle. These portraits present the act of facing the insecurities, the guilt, the fear, and other negative thoughts that create obstacles that prevent me from reaching my goals. I appear standing against myself, recognizing that having these ideas and allowing them to affect me is my own responsibility. One of the portraits is titled Final Boss, and the other is titled Continue, posing the question of continuing or not, having the end of the project in sight. The image clearly shows the confrontation and the tension in the narrative of the piece. Both figures appear with the health and power bars on the same levels, making it known that I have as much probability to succeed as I have to fail, with the timer adding pressure of having to do everything on time. In the previous chapter, we also have a painting that shows choosing from different options, taking into account the available paths. In this painting, paths are crossed and there is an imminent confrontation with that which prevents us from moving forward. There is an evident contrast between the figures. One wears black clothes and the other wears white, simulating chess pieces. This is a payoff to the chessboard floor in the painting Careful What You Wish For from chapter 2. That is a chapter that exists in symmetry with this chapter. Also, the image in the painting replicates a video game format that again connects it to chapter 2. In Toy Chiquito, the narrative of the painting is based on a movie. In this painting, the black bars give the image a cinematic aspect, also emulating a screen. The meaning of this painting can be interpreted as people having a good and bad side, or more generally, that in every person there is a chance of having ideas or committing acts that go against what we believe we are. This was originally meant to be the last painting of the project. However, its content was too inconclusive for an ending. Although this remains the climax of my identity conflict, there is a final chapter to give the narrative the closure it deserves. Borders. All paintings are unframed. Each canvas has a specific treatment to its borders. Some continue the image in the frontal plane. Some have a border that complements or contrasts with the tones and colors used in the portraits, and others have a simulated painted frame. For example, in this painting, the borders are painted in the color of the flags of the represented countries. In this one, we see a painted frame that separates the portraits. And here we have a painting with black borders and stripes that simulate a screen. The paintings, despite not being framed, are self-contained. Adding a frame would create a more pronounced and abrupt separation between the narrative of the paintings, and that's why I decided to leave them like this. For this painting, I took photos in combat poses with two different outfits. But since I didn't have enough white garments, I edited the colors and tones digitally to make it work. For the background, I used a photo taken in Mexico that shows a cobbled road with an open environment and a cloudy sky. This photo had a symmetry to it and had a dramatic atmosphere that would combine well with the narrative of the piece, but without distracting elements that would take away from the interaction of the figures. I followed the process of transferring the drawing with a grid and then began blocking out areas with paint, this time without underpainting, taking advantage of the brightness of the white canvas to have more vibrant colors. Working on a 10 by 10 inch canvas, it was a challenge to make everything look accurate. This was the smallest painting in the main line of the project, despite it representing one of the biggest concepts, which is fighting myself and facing my situation in my journey of finding my identity. I am writing this with my left hand, because my handwriting with my right hand is too pretty. I am writing this with my right hand, because my handwriting with my left hand is too ugly. I now show the scars of the wounds that remained hidden for so long. Chapter 11. Recall and Rebirth. En mi memoria, en memoria mía. This chapter is the closing of the project. It's recognizing life is not permanent, giving value and meaning to both what I have lived and my remaining life ahead. It's remembering and celebrating my existence while getting rid of all layers that conceal my true self. The first portrait of the chapter is titled En mi memoria, that translates to In my memory. And the second one is titled En memoria mía, or In memory of me. It is looking ahead at a rebirth while honoring what I have left behind. It is a synthesis of having put out every version of me to gather the pieces and put together a comprehensive, unified identity that better embodies the person I am. In the previous chapter, I am in conflict with myself, knowing that to reconcile my thoughts and feelings, I will have to change and even get rid of some parts of me. In this painting, I am shown defeated, but also carrying the personification of my defeat and showing my strength. If in the first painting I show myself completely covered in a garment with long hair, I now appear unclothed with barely any hair to show that I have stripped myself of all layers, exposing my true self. On the other hand, we have the baby that is now represented fully grown and decaying. The greenish color in the background of the first painting becomes a deep dark green in the last, and the brown cloth appears now as a backdrop to the figures. The black in the background is for mourning what I am leaving behind, but the green is for awaiting what comes ahead. Venus. This animation shows the transcendence of a person as a model that materializes in a work of art. It's recognizing that I won't last forever and everything has a cycle. This painting is the counterpart to the first painting of the project. As such, there are a series of formal and narrative elements that connects them. The painting from Chapter 1 measures at 24 by 18 inches in vertical format, while Chapter 11 is 18 inches by 24 inches in a horizontal format. Both paintings also have green in the background. This composition is based on Michelangelo's Pietà sculpture, in which Jesus is carried in the arms of his mother, which I believe is a perfect close to what started with a reference to the Madonna and Child. Longing for a reason to believe in oneself through the eyes of someone else. Hidden and protected behind layers. But even with a mask on, some lies manage to filter through the eyes. There are secrets I have yet to admit to myself, and stories to share for those who care. To witness the change, allowing oneself to evolve, growing into my soul until showing the true colors. Thinking of the end that gives meaning to the beginning and all the moments in between. I surrender and give you my truth to make myself visible. With you I leave my heart, take care when I depart. If you are watching this, thank you. Art becomes meaningful only when it can be shared, and I feel fortunate to have with whom to communicate my message. I was tired of waiting for someone to recognize the importance of my effort and my story, so I decided to do it myself, expressing what I always wanted to say but never did. This project was my reason for waking up and working hard day after day. Now that it is accomplished, I know it was all worth it. Just like mine, there are many other stories that deserve to be shared. If I can inspire someone else to tell their own story in the way I was once inspired, I feel like my purpose would be fulfilled. It's hard to express in words how much this all means to me. It's my way of validating my story, recognizing my motives, and giving meaning to my past, so that I can better understand the person I am and live life with more intention. I hope to move on to other subjects and tell many more stories, with the same dignifying approach that takes into account the complexities of the human identity of each individual. I have very much gratitude and appreciation for all the support. Thank you.